When the man stepped into the karate studio, everything about him seemed to clash with the clean, orderly space. His shoes were worn, barely holding together. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, faded and mismatched, telling the silent story of hardship. He had no gym bag, no gloves, no water bottle, none of the tools or accessories that the other students casually tossed around as they prepared for class. Immediately, the room noticed. Some students glanced his way, others didn't bother to hide their amusement. They looked at him, then at each other, their expressions saying what their mouths didn't. He doesn't belong here. The instructor looked up from adjusting his black belt and paused. It wasn't hostility that filled the room, it was dismissal, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be felt. It was written in the smirks, the sideways glances, the deliberate turning of shoulders to exclude him from the circle. No one asked his name. No one offered help. He had walked into their space, and the space silently rejected him. This wasn't the first time he'd felt that. Being overlooked had become part of his daily rhythm. On the streets, in stores, even at shelters, people looked past him, rarely at him. His skin, his clothes, and the way he moved through the world made him invisible. But something about this space was different. Maybe it was the way the mat smelled faintly of sweat and hard work. Maybe it was the posters of champions lining the wall. Or maybe it was just a long-buried instinct from another life, nudging him to step inside. He sat down quietly in the back, legs crossed, posture straight. He didn't try to blend in. He knew he couldn't, but he watched, carefully. Every move, every stance, every shout. The class went on, and while the students were practicing their forms, he mimicked them subtly, hands low, eyes sharp. His body remembered more than anyone could have guessed. His muscles reacted without permission, trained years ago, somewhere in a life no one here had ever lived through or even imagined. The whispers started again when he stood up. One of the younger students laughed. "What's he doing?" someone asked. The instructor turned around slowly. The man approached, not with swagger, not with apology, just with a simple question. "Mind if I try?" There was a pause. Everyone waited for the teacher to say no. But instead, after a long look, the instructor stepped aside and nodded. The room fell into an uncertain hush, the kind that comes before either something incredible or something awkward. The man stepped onto the mat barefoot. His feet looked rough, marked by years of walking and sleeping outside. Still, they moved with precision as he positioned himself. His first stance silenced the entire dojo. It wasn't just correct, it was sharp. Clean lines, strong form, a perfect foundation. Then came the first strike. A basic punch, but executed with such force and speed that one of the senior students instinctively stepped back. The instructor's expression changed. Not shocked, focused. He saw it too. This wasn't someone pretending. This was someone trained. But that didn't stop the lingering thoughts in the room. How could someone like him know anything about this? Was it luck? A trick? A fluke? Even as he moved from form to form, showing precision and power, part of the room still refused to believe what they were seeing. That disbelief didn't come from logic. It came from bias. Deep-seated ideas about what a karate student should look like. About what someone homeless is capable of. About how poverty and discipline aren't supposed to go together. And yet, here he was, embodying everything the art stood for: control, focus, humility, and strength. Without saying a word, he challenged every assumption in that room. He became the question they didn't know they were afraid to ask. What if we've been wrong about people like him this whole time? The dojo, a place meant for growth and discipline, had become a mirror. And in that mirror, every person in that room saw their own prejudices reflecting back at them. As the man stood in the doorway of the dojo, silence met him. Not the respectful silence of a student before a master, but the awkward kind that creeps in when discomfort fills a room. It wasn't the kind of quiet that welcomed or embraced. It was the kind that judged. All eyes shifted toward him, not because he did anything wrong, but because everything about him looked out of place. His skin was darker than anyone else's in the room. His clothes bore the wear and grime of hard living. He carried no signs of training, no uniform, no belt, no gym bag. Just a stillness that came from living life at the bottom while watching others move above. The laughter didn't start loud. It came first in the form of stifled chuckles, small elbow nudges, exchanged glances that held unspoken jokes. He didn't react. Not even a glance. That silence, his silence, was his shield. He stood still while whispers snaked around him. He heard every word. Does he even know what this is? Looks like he wandered in from the street. Bet he can't even throw a punch. None of it was said loud enough to get caught, but it wasn't meant to be hidden either. It was performative in the way cruelty often is, just loud enough to let him know he wasn't welcome, but quiet enough to avoid being called out. Still, he stood there, shoulders relaxed, face unreadable. He didn't fidget, didn't back away. He didn't ask for validation, nor did he argue his right to be there. That stillness wasn't indifference. It was control. A deep, practiced patience. The kind that doesn't need to fight for attention because it knows exactly who it is. There was a strength in that silence that nobody in the room could name yet. It unsettled some of them. Because nothing confuses the insecure more than confidence that doesn't shout. He made his way to the side of the room and sat cross-legged on the floor, hands on his knees, spine straight. His posture wasn't slouched or defeated. It was meditative, intentional. He observed every movement in the class. He watched the way the instructor corrected stances, listened to every instruction, followed every gesture. The laughter faded, replaced by a kind of discomfort. They wanted him to react. Maybe walk out. Maybe challenge someone. Maybe confirm their assumptions. But he didn't. He just remained still, present, watching. There is something deeply threatening to those who laugh from insecurity when their laughter is met not with anger, but with silence. Not with retreat, but with self-possession. His silence said more than words ever could. It said, I don't owe you a reaction. It said, I am not here for you. It said, your laughter does not define me. He didn't try to explain his presence, didn't seek to win them over. His very being there was already a challenge to everything they thought they knew. And yet, beneath the surface, some of them began to shift. Confusion replaced arrogance. Curiosity started replacing judgment. Who was this man? Why wasn't he reacting? Why did he carry himself like someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide? They didn't know his story. That once, years ago, he'd stood in a similar stance in a different dojo, wearing a clean GI and a beginner's belt. That he'd trained hard under a master who believed in discipline, not status. That life had knocked him down more than once, but never out. And though he lost everything else, his job, his home, his comfort, he never lost that core. That still center where strength lives. So when he asked to join, the request came without apology or arrogance. Just calm assurance. It wasn't a challenge, but an invitation. A simple question, may I try? He wasn't demanding space. He was simply stepping into it. And when the instructor allowed him on the mat, some expected him to fail. Some hoped he would. It would make their laughter feel justified. But he moved with precision. His body spoke a language of training that only those who've practiced long enough can recognize. With every step, every motion, he quieted the room not through dominance, but through presence. Still, even as he moved, not everyone accepted what they saw. Some told themselves it was a fluke. That maybe he just watched a lot of martial arts videos. That anyone could get lucky. But their denial wasn't about him. It was about them. About the idea that someone they laughed at, someone who looked so unlike them, could possess a level of skill and mastery they hadn't yet reached. Their laughter hadn't wounded him. It had exposed them. He waited until the end of the class. He hadn't spoken a word the entire time, and yet, everyone had noticed him. Not because he disrupted anything, but because his presence itself felt like a disruption to their routine. While others sparred and practiced their forms, he remained seated, watching everything with the calm focus of someone studying not just techniques, but behaviors, reactions, discipline. He didn't look impressed. He didn't look intimidated either. He looked like someone who had already been through more difficult trials than a dojo could offer. He studied their strengths, their weaknesses, their habits, quietly, without judgment, without ego. When class was over, some of the students walked past him, avoiding eye contact. A few glanced at him quickly and looked away. The instructor approached, ready to dismiss the session, when the man stood up. He didn't puff his chest. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped forward and said, "Mind if I try?" It was just 5 words. No speech. No explanation. No backstory. He didn't say where he came from or why he was there. He didn't ask if he was allowed. He asked if he could try. That distinction mattered. He didn't seek permission to belong, only an opportunity to perform. He didn't demand acknowledgement. He didn't attempt to prove anything with words. His request was made with the quiet confidence of someone who had stopped waiting for others to validate his worth. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply stating his intent. That's the power of asking to try. It's not an act of weakness. It's an act of agency. It says, I know what I can do. I just need a space to do it. The instructor paused, sensing something in the man's tone. It wasn't challenging. It wasn't boastful. It was grounded, measured, real. The dojo, a place often filled with noise, shouts, slaps of feet on mats, claps of impact, suddenly felt still. The students, who had dismissed him as just another outsider, were now paying attention in a way they hadn't expected to. Some of them looked amused, still holding on to their skepticism. Others were curious, unsure what would happen next. The man stepped onto the mat with no shoes, no uniform, and no belt. What he carried instead was presence. A presence that didn't need to be explained. He bowed, not exaggerated, not forced, just a respectful nod to the space. Then, without waiting for applause or attention, he positioned himself in a stance that immediately shifted the room's energy. His form was exact, not flashy, but precise. The kind of precision that only comes from repetition and dedication. The kind of control that separates those who mimic from those who master. He didn't need to warm up. His body moved like it remembered things his mouth never needed to say. Every shift of weight, every angle of the elbow, every alignment of the hip told a story. Not just of training, but of discipline under pressure. Of self-control learned not in perfect dojos, but in cold alleys and shelter basements. This wasn't someone trying to prove himself to others. This was someone honoring something he still held sacred inside himself. The class watched in silence. Their earlier jokes seemed distant now, almost embarrassing in hindsight. His movements weren't just good, they were excellent. And still, he wasn't performing for applause. He was simply doing what he had come to do, try. Not to win anyone over, not to prove anyone wrong, but because something inside him told him to step forward and trust his own worth. That's the core of it. So many wait for others to give them permission. They wait until they look right, sound right, dress right. They wait until they feel ready in the eyes of the world. But he didn't. He asked to try not because he needed approval, but because he had already given himself the authority to move forward. He didn't ask for acceptance. He assumed his own value, and in doing so, disrupted every assumption that surrounded him. He asked for space, not sympathy. Opportunity, not pity. A chance, not a guarantee. The moment his foot touched the mat, something shifted in the room. The laughter had already died out, but what replaced it wasn't respect yet, it was disbelief. People don't change their minds easily. Most of the students still carried the same doubts they had when he first walked in. But he didn't need their belief to begin. His movements spoke for him, and what they said cut through every stereotype lingering in the air. He started slow. A basic stance. One that every beginner learns, but few ever perfect. And yet, his foundation was flawless. He didn't wobble, didn't adjust mid-motion, didn't hesitate. His feet were planted with confidence, his back straight, arms in perfect position. There was no exaggeration, no overcompensation. Just clean, precise execution. It was the kind of form that only comes from muscle memory deeply ingrained. Hours and hours of repetition, long before life took a turn for the worse. With each move, the murmurs faded. Jaws that had smirked were now slack with disbelief. Eyes narrowed, focusing not on the man's clothes or face anymore, but on his motion. The disbelief gave way to something else, curiosity. A quiet kind of attention, the kind usually reserved for masters. He transitioned through forms with control and intention, each technique more advanced than the last, and each one executed with a discipline that defied their assumptions. Then came the challenge that changed everything. The instructor, watching intently, called for the strike board, a test reserved for belt advancement, typically planned and practiced in advance. The man gave a small nod. No fear, no bravado. He stepped up, examined the height and resistance of the board, then returned to his stance. No countdown, no prep talk, just silence and stillness, and then explosive speed. The sound of the brake echoed. A crisp, sudden crack that filled the room. The board didn't just split, it snapped clean through, with the kind of precision and impact rarely seen, even among seasoned students. No warm-up, no practice, just raw execution, delivered with focus and force. The room stood still. For a moment, no one said anything. They couldn't. What they had witnessed was not just physical skill, it was mastery that challenged everything they thought they knew. And then the instructor, still holding the broken board, asked for another. This time, a double layer. The kind of challenge that most black belts don't face until well into their training. Without hesitation, the man positioned himself again. This time, his stance looked even more centered. Like something deeper had awakened. Like this wasn't just muscle memory anymore, but something personal. And again, strike. Fast. Direct. A thunderous break. The second board shattered just like the first. It was official now. He hadn't just impressed them. He hadn't just proven a point. He had broken a record. A record held for years by the highest-ranking student in the dojo. And he'd done it without a uniform, without formal introduction, and without warning. A man they had laughed at hours earlier had just surpassed them all in technique, focus, and execution. But the real impact wasn't just in what he broke. It was in what he broke through. The wall of assumption. The quiet barrier built on years of believing that discipline, skill, and honor come dressed a certain way, from certain people, in certain circumstances. That night, those assumptions fell, one strike at a time. For the students watching, it was more than humbling. It was unsettling, because it forced them to confront the idea that talent and greatness don't always wear uniforms. That brilliance isn't always loud. That strength sometimes comes in quietly, sits in the corner, listens patiently, and then, when the time is right, steps forward and rewrites the rules. And he never said much, not before, not after. He didn't gloat. He didn't explain where he learned or how long he trained. He didn't mention how long he'd been sleeping in shelters or whether he even had a place to return to that night. He just bowed again. Calm, respectful, centered. In that dojo, he didn't just break boards. He broke expectations. He broke hierarchy. He broke the habit of judging someone's worth based on how they enter a room instead of what they're capable of once they're given a fair chance. There was a moment, just after the final board shattered, when the room didn't know how to react. Everyone stood still, not out of respect, but out of confusion. How could someone who looked like that, someone they had dismissed only an hour ago, do something so far beyond what they thought possible? The man didn't seek applause, but silence met him anyway. Not the awkward silence from earlier, but the kind that comes when people are forced to reevaluate everything they just saw. He bowed quietly and stepped back to the edge of the mat. The instructor was still holding the broken pieces of wood, speechless, and the students stood frozen, some staring at the boards, others at the man. For the first time, no one was looking at his clothes. No one was judging his appearance. They were looking at his control, his power, his undeniable presence. Respect didn't come in a sudden wave. It came in fragments. In the way the instructor now addressed him with eye contact. In the way the students shifted their posture, no longer standing with arms crossed or smirks on their faces. Some of them looked at the floor, realizing the things they had thought, or even said, were now shamefully misplaced. Others looked at him with something new in their eyes. Not curiosity, not pity, but recognition. He hadn't asked them to respect him. He hadn't demanded it. He hadn't tried to convince anyone of his worth. He had simply done what he came to do. He had stood still while they laughed, remained calm while they whispered, and performed with excellence when given the chance. It was not words or explanations that earned him respect. It was presence. He let his actions speak with the kind of clarity no speech ever could. That's what they noticed now. That even in the face of judgment, mockery, and being underestimated, he never once lost control. Not of his movements, not of his emotions, and not of the space around him. His restraint wasn't passive, it was powerful. A kind of self-discipline that can't be faked. A discipline earned over years of having to prove himself silently in places that refused to see him. One of the students, who had laughed earlier, stepped forward. He didn't say much, just a simple gesture of acknowledgement. A small nod. And that gesture, subtle as it was, marked the first true shift in the room. Others followed. They didn't all know how to show respect yet, but they understood that something had changed. The man they mocked had now become the standard. Without saying a single boastful word, he had reset the measure of what greatness looked like in that room. Respect is not always loud. It doesn't always come with claps or cheers. Sometimes it shows up in silence, in posture, in the way people begin to treat you differently. Not because they were told to, but because they finally saw you clearly. They saw the control in your movements, the peace in your eyes, the confidence that didn't need to step on others to stand tall. He left the mat as quietly as he had entered it. But this time, eyes followed him not with suspicion, but with awareness. People moved aside without being asked. Space opened for him, not because he took it, but because those who had denied it before now recognized he deserved it. There was no need for correction, no dramatic confrontation, no lecture about judgment or assumptions. He had taught them something by doing what most couldn't, staying calm under scrutiny, holding power without ego, and delivering excellence without the need for validation. The instructor approached him before he left, not to question him, but to invite him back. Not out of guilt, but out of respect. A quiet offering of acknowledgement from one master to another. And while the man gave no guarantee of return, the gesture had already done what it needed to do. The dojo had been changed, not by a fight, not by a debate, but by one man's quiet mastery, displayed in full view of those who doubted him most. They would remember him, not just for what he broke, but for how he carried himself before and after. They would remember the stillness, the silence, the power that never shouted. Respect had been earned the way it always should be, not by demand, but by presence. The street outside the dojo was cold when he stepped out, but he didn't shiver. He had spent too many nights under the open sky to be bothered by wind or weather. There was no crowd following him, no applause ringing behind him, but what had just happened inside would linger far longer than any cheers. He walked away quietly, just as he had arrived, but everything had changed, not for him, but for those who had watched. He had come in as a stranger, dismissed as a nobody, just another man who didn't fit, just another face weathered by the world. But inside, beneath the layers of worn-out clothing and behind tired eyes, was something they hadn't seen at first, a life filled with fight. Not the kind taught in classes, but the kind you earn when the world gives you no room and you take it anyway. That day, he didn't just move through the dojo. He moved through every assumption, every stereotype, every quiet prejudice hiding behind polite eyes and clean uniforms. He came in with no invitation, no resume, no story prepared. And yet, the moment he stood still and asked to try, he began rewriting their expectations. He didn't say where he'd trained. He didn't explain how many years had passed since he last bowed on a mat. He didn't speak of the titles he might have held or the ranks he could have claimed, because none of it mattered to him anymore. What mattered was what he could still do, what his body still remembered, what his spirit still carried. And when he delivered, when he moved with the kind of strength, balance, and calm that only comes from real experience, something deeper shifted. The lesson wasn't just in his technique. It was in what he represented. That greatness doesn't always announce itself. That true mastery doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives humbly, with scars and silence. It walks in slowly, lets people doubt, and then erases those doubts with pure, undeniable action. What they saw wasn't just power. It was endurance. Not just the strength to break boards, but the strength to walk into a room where no one believes in you and still give your best. The strength to remain calm when laughed at. The strength to ask for space when you know it won't be freely given. The strength to rise without anger, to move with purpose, and to leave without needing validation. He was homeless, yes. He was worn down by life, yes. But in that moment, he was more composed, more focused, more in control than anyone in that room. His discipline hadn't faded with his fortune. His skills hadn't left when his address did. And that's what shocked them the most. That someone with nothing material left could still carry so much value within. That someone who'd lost everything still held on to dignity, precision, and power. That contrast forced everyone in the dojo to reconsider what they thought they knew. About skill, about struggle, about who gets to be respected in spaces like these. They realized, maybe for the first time, that the uniforms, the belts, the routines, they don't always reflect the deepest kind of strength. That sometimes the people most worthy of honor are the ones society forgets first. He didn't teach them with words. He didn't scold them for their laughter or their judgment. He simply moved in truth, in quiet, unstoppable truth. And in doing so, he left behind more than broken boards. He left behind a story, one that would be told in whispers first, then repeated with awe. A story about a man who walked into a dojo unwanted and left it transformed. Not with medals, not with recognition, but with the kind of respect that only appears when people are forced to confront what they thought was impossible. The kind of respect that lingers in the silence after someone truly remarkable walks away. The kind that makes people think twice before they judge again. Because from that day on, every time they saw someone who looked out of place, they'd remember him. The man who had nothing, but carried everything that mattered.